One of the most consistent features of Europe's history is that the continent has been divided into lots of small and medium-sized states. Even today, with the multinational alliances like NATO and the European Union, de facto political power rests with the nation-states that make them up. Naturally, some historians have asked whether this persistent pattern of division might have played a role in its rise to global power. One way of looking at it is that the different nations of Europe were basically locked in a kind of Darwinian struggle for existence. To survive, they had to invest in larger armies with better technology and better organization because there was no one single hegemonic power in Europe. Individual nations like Britain and France and Austria were unable to outright conquer one another. Relative to each other, they were roughly equally matched, but at an absolute level, Europe taken as a whole was vastly better organized than anyone else. Some historians, like Walter Scheidel, have argued that competition within the European state system, which was not necessarily limited to just warfare, played a role in promoting state capacity. Basically, think of things like legal courts, national defense, and public infrastructure. These were promoted by international competitive pressures. It's not an unreasonable point. Place yourself in the shoes of a European king. You might see how he might choose to go down the route of encouraging productive private activity, uh, not necessarily out of good faith, mind you. After all, you're doing it to tax them, but by serving their interests, you might end up promoting some of your own as well. In a multi-state system like that in Europe, you might ironically benefit from the self-inflicted wounds of your rivals. As an example, Venice became a huge book producer because it didn't practice censorship to anywhere near the same degree as France did. In this vein, to attract investment, business, and labor, you might want to offer firms and workers all sorts of concessions they find attractive. A much more radical interpretation sees the wars themselves as the productive element. These are what we might call the military industrial complex theories of the rise of the West. The historian William McNeill basically saw state demand for certain goods and services as a force promoting economic development. Under normal peacetime conditions, he argues, resources are sitting idle that are going to waste, but war forces states to look for whatever they can get their hands on. McNeill even went so far as to argue that Britain's Industrial Revolution was sped up considerably by the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, there is also the imperialistic expansion that often also accompanied military contests. This is a point some Marxist historians and most world systems theorists emphasize in explaining the rise of the West, and even some non-Marxists. But there's a problem with the war-centric stories. I'm not really convinced by these military-centric explanations because they tend to gloss over the immense costs inherent to the state system. First, you have the literal costs. Some historians basically argue that war, quote-unquote, stimulates the economy, but this interpretation ignores opportunity costs. Producing 500,000 rifles for use in war stimulates the economy no more than digging holes in the ground just to fill them up again. These are not choices that individual people would make to further their own well-being. This is a choice made by coercive authorities against their wishes. In the real world, truly massive amounts of resources were funneled through the military apparatuses of Sweden, Russia, and France without resulting in an industrial revolution there. There is nothing uniquely powerful about the demands placed on society by wartime conditions that, make them more better organized or richer. And again, in the process of preparing for and waging war, peaceful uses of scarce resources are lost. And second, the sheer amount of suffering that has happened in European history as a result of constant wars is staggering. Constant wars have produced massive numbers of deaths, centuries of ethnic and sectarian hatred, famines, and even permanently set back entire regions for centuries. During the 30 Years' War alone, some parts of Germany had their populations reduced by nearly a half. And third, in reality, most states didn't go down the ideal benevolent public goods path I described above. In practice, the rulers of most pre-modern European states were allied to one or another vested interest group that promised support in return for special privileges. Most European states were wedded to a mercantilist economic policy and saw the world economy as a zero-sum game. Very often, the state capacity developed as a result of international conflict was developed for and used to further the interests of some privileged group instead of the common good. And fourth, if you want to look at military outcomes, it's not really clear if Europe gained an advantage from being a state system. The conquest of the Americas was a sheer accident of insane luck on the part of the Spanish and diseases that decimated the native populations. The Europeans couldn't replicate this accident in the rest of Eurasia, where they were mostly confined to the coasts of states that were much more populous than themselves. Large-scale colonial conquests only came after industrialization. This is not to say that international conflict and war are always completely meaningless. The ends you fight for can be basically good, like national defense. It's it's not a good idea to give absolute black and white moral advice like violence never works to someone being robbed on the street. But no matter how you look at it, there's still a tremendous material cost associated with warfare, and sadly, it's all too common that once started, wars take on a life of their own, and their belligerents are completely helpless to stop them. This was especially the case in pre-modern Europe. Does this mean the state system was more harmful than beneficial? You can make a very reasonable argument for this. From the point of view of average ordinary people, farmers, artisans, butchers, brewers, it's hard to see what good they personally got out of it. But there is another interpretation I find a lot more convincing. David Hume, who is today mostly remembered as a philosopher, but he was also a prolific essayist and historian, observed, "Every improvement which we have since made since 200 years prior has arisen from our imitation of foreigners, and we ought so far to esteem it happy that they had previously made advances in arts and ingenuity. Notwithstanding the advanced state of our manufactures, we daily adopt in every art the inventions and improvements of our neighbours." Economists call the process of using the difference in prices of one good between two different areas to earn a profit arbitrage. In a similar fashion, we can think of a process of creative arbitrage taking place in pre-modern Europe, where skills, ideas, and technologies developed one place could be transmitted to wherever else they could also be profitably used. Not all of Europe was equally inventive. There were more highly concentrated pockets of innovation, like 15th century Portugal or the Netherlands during its golden age. I think it's remarkable that even an autocrat of an absolutist regime like Peter the Great of Russia knew he not just could but should borrow techniques invented elsewhere. He hired Dutch and British naval experts and engineers en masse to support his naval expansion project. It's a sort of strange way to put it, but I like the way Eric Jones put it. In the state system, Europe had a portfolio of competing and colluding polities whose spirit of competition was adapted to diffusing best practices. More controversially, we might be tempted to ask with a question with a pretty big value assumption. Was a decentralized state system more prone to promoting freedom, with the tacit assumption being that freedom promotes development? So far, at least, I'm an agnostic on the question. But the fact is that a state system is more likely to have at least some polities that are freer and more open than others. And as for the assumption, you don't need to go much further than the common sense observation that you learn by doing. If a state is overly regulated, deeply intolerant, and oppressive, you don't do, and hence you don't learn. In a very concrete sense, cultural and economic freedom means precisely the freedom to experiment. Think back to the example of Venice being a center of the European book printing process or business, or how the Dutch Republic was a haven for radical religious thought during the 17th century. There's a reason why these places were more dynamic than their neighbors. It's because they became focus points for ideas, manpower, and investment from all over Europe. I think it makes more sense to argue that this state system tends to prevent autocratic states from getting total dominance. This is a very contingent process. You can't accurately predict how a state is going to develop, and the general pattern, at least, that emerged for much of the early modern period was that autocratic, absolutist monarchs tried to overthrow the accountability placed on them by aristocratic parliaments. The Spanish kings and Russian tsars more or less succeeded at this. However, in the Dutch Republic and England, this didn't happen, and they maintained something like a constitutional, accountable government with rule of law. The critical thing here is that in a multi-state system like that of Europe, there was not one single, totally dominant nation that could impose its own values and institutions on the entire continent. And these persistent divisions, combined with relative openness and freedom in some areas, led to a consistently high level of religious, intellectual, and technological change. Or so the conjecture runs here, at least. It's not really something you can prove the same way you can prove a mathematical formula. But I think there is some merit to the argument that diversity and freedom promoted innovation in Europe. The counterfactual here is China. In a similar vein to the European division argument, some historians argue that Chinese unity is more or less a permanent feature of its cultural and political history. If we just take this claim at face value, we might reasonably ask whether unity might also promote progress. After all, in a reasonably a large centralized empire like China, it presumably doesn't suffer from endemic warfare or exploitative practices like mercantilism. At least at a first glance, you might imagine that a large unitary empire would be more beneficial to promoting cultural and economic progress than a state system. But I don't really see China being any less prone to warfare or any more economically integrated than pre-modern Europe was. The three deadliest conflicts in the world in their respective centuries, the Anlushan Rebellion, the Ming-Qing Transition, and the Taiping Rebellion, were fought exclusively within the borders of China. And while China did have long-range internal trade like Europe did, it failed to move towards greater market integration over time. And China actually experienced far greater technological and intellectual change during times of disintegration, not unity. Unlike China, Europe didn't suffer from being the biggest guy in the neighborhood. China was surrounded by lots of smaller tributary states and tribal confederacies, but outside of times of serious hardship, they weren't any real existential threat. There was no real external force to act as a reality check for the Chinese leadership. It's illustrative that at the very same time that several European nations embarked on their own voyages of exploration and never stopped looking outwards, the Chinese Ming Dynasty pulled back from the global stage and turned strictly isolationist and xenophobic. Interestingly, China's unity was probably just as contingent as Europe's division. Both of these regions underwent major environmental and political struggles during the 3rd century AD, and it was China that collapsed first, not the Roman Empire. China wouldn't unify again until the 7th century under the short-lived Sui dynasty. Conceivably, there might have been a timeline where China remained divided to the present while Europe was unified under a kind of neo-Roman empire created through the marriage of Charlemagne and the Byzantine Empress Irene. But other regions of Eurasia should serve as a warning against the dangers of excessive fragmentation. Regions like India and Southeast Asia were politically divided the same way Europe was, the former being around for several thousand years longer than Europe even existed as an idea, seemingly without resulting in an earlier commercial, cultural, or technological breakthrough. I mean, there are still a lot of questions and implications left unanswered, and it's something that's going to take a lot more time to go through than just one short video like this. For now, at least, I settle on the cautiously confident view that while the European state system was a very costly, and not to say violent, geopolitical setup, it probably mattered a lot for its long-run dynamism.